The morning of July 25, 1944, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein crouched in his command post 3 kilometers southwest of St. Lo, listening. The sound was different from anything he had experienced in 5 years of war. Not the scream of Stukas over Poland. Not the thunder of Soviet artillery at Moscow. Not even the rolling barrage at El Alamein. This was something else entirely. The sky above Normandy had turned black with aircraft. 1,500 heavy bombers. 500 fighter bombers. Wave after wave, flying in perfect formation, their engines creating a drone so loud that Bayerlein staff officers had to shout to be heard. Below them, arranged in defensive positions along the Purrier-St. Lo road, 2,200 soldiers of Panzer Lehr Division waited in their foxholes. They were veterans. Men who had survived Russia, North Africa, Sicily. They had learned to dig deep, to keep their heads down, to endure whatever the enemy threw at them. They believed their training, their discipline, their fortifications would see them through. They were about to discover they were wrong. Bayerlein watched the first bombs fall. They came down in a carpet, methodical, relentless, transforming the landscape into a moonscape of overlapping craters. The earth shook with such violence that men inside concrete bunkers felt the structures crack around them. Telephone lines snapped. Radio antennas toppled. Command posts that had taken weeks to build vanished in seconds. Then came the American artillery, 1,000 guns, all firing at once. What happened over the next 72 hours would force German generals to confront a truth they had spent 5 years avoiding. The Americans did not fight the way Europeans fought. They did not rely on individual courage or tactical brilliance or the quality of their soldiery. They relied on something else. Something the Germans had no answer for. They relied on firepower. Industrial firepower. Firepower so overwhelming, so precisely coordinated, so inexhaustible that it rendered traditional military skill almost meaningless. And the tool they used to deliver this firepower, the weapon that terrified German generals more than any other, was American artillery. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how American artillery came to dominate the battlefield in World War II is not a story about superior German engineering meeting its match. It is not a story about wonder weapons or technological breakthroughs. It is a story about a fundamental difference in how two armies conceived of warfare itself. The Germans, for all their vaunted military prowess, fought a craftsman's war. They believed in the primacy of the well-trained soldier, the precisely executed maneuver, the decisive battle. Their artillery, while excellent in quality, was treated as a supporting arm, something to assist infantry and armor, something to be deployed carefully, husband resources, fire when necessary. The Americans fought an industrial war. They believed in systems, in coordination, in the multiplication of force through organization and logistics. They treated artillery not as a support weapon but as the primary killer on the battlefield. Everything else, infantry, armor, air power, existed to create conditions in which artillery could do its work. This philosophical difference had practical consequences that German generals would document in painful detail. The German army entered the invasion of France in 1940 with one of the finest artillery arms in the world. The standard German field piece, the 10.5-centimeter Lu FH-18 howitzer, was a superb weapon. Accurate, reliable, effective. German artillery doctrine, inherited from the First World War, emphasized indirect fire, pre-registered targets, and meticulously planned fire missions. German gunners trained for years. They learned mathematics, trigonometry, meteorology. They could calculate firing solutions in their heads. They took pride in their precision. A German artillery battery could place shells with remarkable accuracy, hitting targets with minimal ammunition expenditure. This worked brilliantly in 1940, in Poland, in France. In the early campaigns in Russia, German artillery supported rapid advances by mechanized forces. It broke up enemy concentrations. It suppressed resistance long enough for German infantry to close and destroy the enemy in close combat. But as the war progressed, the Germans discovered problems they could not solve. The first problem was supply. German artillery batteries began the war with generous ammunition allocations. By 1941 in Russia, those allocations had already begun to shrink. The distances were too great. The Soviet Union was too vast. German logistics, dependent on horses and railroads, could not keep up with the demands of mobile warfare across the Russian steppe. By late 1941, German heavy artillery units on the Eastern Front typically had about 50 rounds per gun on hand. 50 rounds. To support operations across hundreds of kilometers of front. Battery commanders received strict orders to conserve ammunition, to fire only when absolutely necessary, to make every shell count. This forced German artillery into a defensive mindset. Fire missions that would have been routine in 1940 became carefully considered luxuries in 1942. German gunners learned to watch their ammunition stocks with the same anxiety a man in a desert watches his canteen. The second problem was mobility. German artillery was largely horse-drawn. The WWII-18 howitzer weighed 1,800 kilograms. It required a team of 6 horses to move. Heavier pieces required even more. The German army in 1944 still relied on more than 1 million horses to move supplies, pull guns, transport equipment. Horses are vulnerable. They require food, water, rest. They cannot move quickly over long distances. They panic under artillery fire. They die easily when strafed by aircraft. By 1944, Allied air superiority made it suicidal for German artillery to move in daylight. Gun crews learned to displace only at night, crawling from position to position, hoping to avoid detection. The third problem was centralization. German artillery doctrine was decentralized by design. Batteries were attached to specific divisions. Division commanders controlled their own guns. This gave divisions flexibility, allowed them to respond quickly to local situations. But it also meant that German artillery could not mass fires effectively. A German division facing an American attack could call on its own guns, perhaps 36 pieces, maybe 48 if additional units were attached. But coordinating fire from multiple divisions was difficult, time-consuming, often impossible in the chaos of combat. German commanders recognized these problems. They wrote about them in after-action reports. They proposed solutions: more motorized transport, better ammunition supply, improved coordination. But the German war economy by 1944 could not produce what the generals needed. Every truck allocated to artillery was a truck not hauling supplies to the front. Every shell produced was a shell not available for anti-tank guns or tank ammunition. Germany was fighting a war of scarcity. And in a war of scarcity, hard choices had to be made. The Americans made different choices. American artillery doctrine did not evolve from Prussian military tradition or Napoleonic battles. It evolved from American industrial practice and the American way of solving problems. If something worked, you standardized it. If you needed more, you built more. If coordination improved effectiveness, you coordinated everything. The foundation of American artillery superiority was standardization. The United States Army went to war with a relatively small number of artillery types. The M101A1, 105 mm howitzer. The M114, 155 mm howitzer. The M1 155 mm gun. The M2 155 mm gun, nicknamed Long Tom. That was essentially it. For main types, all produced in enormous quantities, all using standardized ammunition, all sharing common parts, all supported by the same training doctrine, the same fire direction procedures, the same logistics system. This created efficiencies the Germans could not match. An American artillery unit receiving replacement howitzers did not need to retrain on new equipment. An American forward observer calling for fire did not need to know which specific battery would respond or what type of guns it employed. An American ammunition truck could resupply any artillery unit without worrying about incompatible shells. The Americans also solved the mobility problem in the most straightforward way possible. They motorized everything. Every American artillery piece was towed by a truck. The M2 half-track, the M5 high-speed tractor, the Diamond T tank transporter for the heaviest guns. Every vehicle was mechanized, reliable, mass-produced. This gave American artillery incredible mobility. A German artillery battery required hours to displace, unhitching horses, moving guns by animal power, setting up in new positions. An American battery could displace in minutes. Trucks hitched to guns. Guns towed to new positions. Trucks unhitched. Guns laid and ready to fire. The entire process could happen faster than the Germans could call in counter-battery fire. But the real innovation was in fire direction. American artillery revolutionized how fires were coordinated. The system they developed was called the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. Every artillery battalion had one. The FDC was a command post staffed by specially trained officers and NCOs who did nothing but calculate firing solutions and coordinate fires. When a forward observer called for fire, he did not call a specific battery. He called the FDC. The FDC determined which guns would fire, calculated the firing data, transmitted orders to batteries, and adjusted fire based on observer corrections. The entire system was designed for speed and coordination. The Americans then took this system and scaled it up. Battalion FDCs could combine fires from multiple batteries. Regimental FDCs could combine fires from multiple battalions. Division artillery headquarters could combine fires from multiple regiments. Corps artillery headquarters could combine fires from multiple divisions. This created a capability the Germans could not counter. An American infantry company in contact with the enemy could call for fire support and receive, within minutes, concentrated fire from dozens of guns scattered across kilometers of rear area. The German company commander facing them would have no idea where the fire was coming from, how many guns were firing, or how to suppress them. The system reached its ultimate expression in a fire mission type called the Time on Target, or TOT. The concept was simple but devastating. Multiple batteries, sometimes from different battalions, would fire at the same target. But instead of firing simultaneously, each battery would calculate its firing data to ensure that all shells, from guns at different ranges, different azimuths, different elevations, arrived on target at exactly the same moment. The result was a sudden, catastrophic concentration of high explosive. No preliminary rounds to warn the enemy. No gradual buildup. Just instant, overwhelming violence. Soldiers caught in a TOT strike had no time to take cover, no opportunity to disperse. They simply died. German prisoners of war interrogated after battles in Normandy repeatedly mentioned the heavy volume of American fire. Not its accuracy, though it was accurate enough. Not its sophistication, just its volume. The sheer, unrelenting quantity of high explosive that Americans seemed able to deliver on demand. The numbers tell the story. During Operation Cobra, in support of the American breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, American artillery fired approximately 12,000 rounds per day. Not total. Per day. For multiple days. For comparison, General Hans Eberbach, commanding 5th Panzer Army against the British in Normandy, reported that his artillery could fire approximately 10% of what the British fired. The British, who were themselves firing less than the Americans. Eberbach's artillery included guns captured from every major European power. French 75s. Soviet 122mm howitzers. Czech mountain guns. Italian pieces. Acquiring ammunition for this menagerie was a logistical nightmare. Acquiring enough ammunition to conduct sustained fire missions was impossible. The Americans, meanwhile, had ammunition to spare. So much ammunition that they used it profligately. If a position might contain enemy troops, they shelled it. If a road might be used for enemy movement, they interdicted it. If a tree line might conceal observers, they destroyed it. This reflected a fundamental calculation. American commanders valued the lives of their soldiers more than they valued ammunition. Shells were cheap, replaceable. Men were not, so they spent shells to save men. Lavishly. Fritz Bayerlein learned this lesson on July 25, 1944. The bombing ended after 90 minutes. Bayerlein emerged from his bunker to find a landscape that no longer resembled Earth. Every tree within the bombing zone had been sheared off at ground level. Every structure had been flattened. The roads, carefully maintained by German engineers, had vanished beneath overlapping craters. His division had been annihilated. Not defeated. Not forced to withdraw. Annihilated. Of the 2,200 men in the main defense line, roughly 700 were dead. Another 1,000 were wounded, crazed, or so shell-shocked they could no longer function as soldiers. The division's carefully hoarded tank strength, 47 operational panzers that morning, had been reduced to 12. 3 of his forward command posts had been obliterated. Communication with higher headquarters was severed. Then the American infantry attacked. And behind them came more artillery. And more. And more. Bayerlein telephoned his corps commander, General der Artillerie Erich Marx. The conversation, recorded in German army records, tells you everything you need to know about what happened that day. Herr General, my grenadiers and the pioneers, my anti-tank gunners, they're holding, Bayerlein said. None of them have left their positions. None. They're lying in their holes, still and mute, because they are dead. Dead. Do you understand? Marx understood. He ordered Bayerlein to hold anyway. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B from his headquarters well behind the front, also ordered Bayerlein to hold. Not a single man was to leave his position. The Americans had to be stopped. Bayerlein's response has entered military history. Out in front, everyone is holding out. Everyone. My grenadiers and my engineers and my tank crews, they're all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post. They're lying silent in their foxholes because they are dead. He continued, my front lines looked like the face of the moon. At least 70% of my troops were out of action. Dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. The Panzer Lehr Division ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Within 72 hours, American armored spearheads had broken through the German line and were racing into open country. The Normandy front, which had been static for nearly 2 months, collapsed. The American breakout, Operation Cobra, had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, and the weapon that made it possible was not the bomber. The bombing, for all its psychological impact, had actually been less effective than planned. Many bombs had fallen short, killing and wounding American troops. Much of the German defensive line had survived the bombing relatively intact. It was the artillery that finished Panzer Lehr. The bombing created shock. The artillery created death. Hour after hour, day after day. Whenever German troops tried to regroup, American observers called in fire. Whenever German reinforcements attempted to move forward, American guns interdicted them. Whenever German commanders tried to establish new defensive lines, American shells tore them apart. General Bayerlein survived. His division did not. By July 27th, Panzerlehr had been reduced to 8 operational tanks and a few hundred men. The rest were casualties or scattered fugitives. The division was pulled from the line, sent to Paris to rest and refit. But there was no rest, and there would be no refitting that could prepare German commanders for what was coming. Because Operation Cobra was just the beginning. What Bayerlein experienced in July 1944 was about to be repeated across France on a scale that would destroy the German army in the West. The battle following Operation Cobra, the American Third Army under General George Patton broke loose into Brittany and began a sweeping advance eastward. Hitler, recognizing the catastrophe unfolding but unable to accept it, ordered a counterattack. Operation Luttich would strike westward from Mortain, drive to the coast at Avranches, and cut off the American spearheads. It was madness. Every German general who received the order knew it. The Americans had overwhelming air superiority. They had unlimited artillery support. They had broken the German defensive line and were operating in open country where their mechanized forces could maneuver freely. Attacking into this buzzsaw would accomplish nothing except the destruction of Germany's remaining armored reserves in France. Hitler ordered it anyway. The attack began on the night of August 6, 1944. 4 panzer divisions, the 2nd, the 116th, the 1st SS, and the 2nd SS, along with the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, concentrated for the assault. On paper, it looked impressive. 5 divisions, hundreds of tanks, elite troops, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front. In reality, these divisions were shadows of their theoretical strength. The 2nd Panzer Division had perhaps 70 operational tanks instead of 200. The 116th had even fewer. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was limited. Air cover was non-existent. But the attack went forward. Under cover of darkness, German armor pushed west through the morning fog. For a few hours, the assault made progress. American forces, surprised by the attack, fell back from Mortain. Hilltop positions changed hands. German officers allowed themselves cautious optimism. Then the fog lifted, and the sun came up, and the American artillery began firing. What followed was slaughter. American forward observers, positioned on high ground overlooking the German axis of advance, had perfect visibility. They called in fire missions with devastating effect. German tank columns, forced to advance along narrow roads through Norman valleys, became killing grounds. American 105mm shells bracketed the routes. 155mm shells walked up and down the columns. Long tom shells, weighing 95 pounds each, obliterated entire German positions with single hits. The Germans had expected this. They knew American artillery was formidable. What they had not expected was the speed of response and the sheer volume of fire available. A German battalion commander radioing for artillery support might wait 30 minutes for his own guns to respond. Then, if ammunition was available, his battery might fire a mission of 50 rounds. Maybe 100 if the target was deemed critical. Then silence as the guns conserved ammunition. An American platoon leader calling for fire support received a response in 5 minutes. Sometimes less, and the fire that arrived was not 50 rounds from one battery. It was 500 rounds from 6 batteries. It was 1,000 rounds from a dozen batteries. It was whatever the artillery commander deemed appropriate for the target, with no consideration of ammunition scarcity because there was no scarcity. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach, a veteran armor commander who had fought across Russia and North Africa, experienced American artillery for the first time during the Mortain counterattack. In his post-war interrogations, he described it with something approaching disbelief. The enemy's superiority in artillery was enormous, Eberbach said. We found that we could expect 10 shells from the enemy for every one of ours. Sometimes the ratio was even higher. This superiority was not just in number of guns but in ammunition supply. The Americans seemed to have unlimited shells. They fired preparatory bombardments that lasted hours. They fired harassment missions throughout the night. They fired at anything that moved. He continued, "Our own artillery was starved for ammunition. Battalion commanders complained constantly. Division commanders begged for more shells. Army headquarters had nothing to give them. We were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. Actually, with both hands tied. The Americans fought as if ammunition cost nothing. The Mordine counterattack collapsed within 48 hours. German armor, unable to advance under constant artillery fire and harassment from American fighter bombers, broke off the attack and attempted to withdraw. But withdrawing under fire is the most difficult military maneuver. Units became disorganized. Columns stretched out. Vehicles broke down and blocked roads. And American artillery followed them every meter of the way. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The failure at Mordine opened the door to an even greater disaster. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group, recognized an opportunity. The Germans had pushed westward at Mordine. American forces had broken out to the south and were now swinging east. British and Canadian forces were pushing south from Caen. The entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, the remnants of Army Group B west of the Seine, were sitting in a pocket around the town of Falaise. Bradley proposed closing the pocket. American forces would drive north from Argentan. Canadian forces would drive south from Caen. The two forces would meet near the town of Chambois, trapping perhaps 20 German divisions inside a killing zone. The plan developed over the second week of August. Allied commanders moved carefully. They had learned in previous encirclements, Tunisia, Sicily, that trapped German forces fought with desperate ferocity. Closing a pocket too quickly could result in heavy Allied casualties, but closing it too slowly allowed Germans to escape. The solution was artillery. Massive, coordinated, overwhelming artillery fire that would turn the interior of the pocket into hell on earth. By August 12th, the pocket was beginning to form. German units found themselves squeezed into an ever-shrinking area. Roads became clogged with vehicles, troops, wounded, supply wagons, horse-drawn artillery. The Norman countryside, divided by ancient hedgerows and small fields, restricted movement. German commanders tried to maintain order, but the situation was deteriorating by the hour. Allied artillery had near-perfect observation. Hills surrounding the pocket provided elevated positions for forward observers. British and Canadian artillery fired from the north. American artillery fired from the south and west. Polish artillery, part of the 1st Polish Armored Division, fired from the east. The Germans were surrounded by guns. And the guns fired. Constantly. Time-on-target missions became routine. A spotter would identify a German column attempting to move along a road. He would call in coordinates. Within minutes, shells from a dozen batteries would arrive simultaneously. The column would cease to exist. Vehicles overturned. Ammunition trucks exploded. Horses panicked and bolted. Survivors scattered into the fields, where more artillery missions hunted them down. German divisions attempting to break out of the pocket ran into walls of shell fire. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, reduced to perhaps 500 men and 15 tanks, attacked Canadian positions repeatedly. Each attack was shredded by artillery before German troops could close with Canadian infantry. Bodies piled up in narrow defile. Destroyed panzers burned in fields. The Polish 1st Armored Division seized a hill designated as Hill 262, called Mont Ormel by the French, called the Mace by Polish troops. From this vantage point, Polish forward observers could see directly into the German escape routes. They called in artillery missions with methodical precision. For 3 days, from August 19 through August 21, Polish troops held Mont Ormel against desperate German attempts to dislodge them. German commanders knew that as long as observers remained on that hill, no German formation could escape without running through artillery fire. So they attacked. Again, and again, and again. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen assaulted the Polish positions. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich attacked from the west. Battle groups from the 2nd Panzer Division attacked from the south. The Poles, outnumbered and running low on ammunition, held their ground. They held because Allied artillery supported them. Every German assault formation was identified, targeted, and destroyed by artillery fire before it could reach Polish lines. When Polish ammunition ran to 5 shells per gun, Allied artillery provided covering fire. When Polish infantry ammunition dropped to 50 rounds per man, Allied artillery broke up German attacks before they could develop. Major Antonin Stefanovich, commanding one of the Polish battle groups on Mont Ormel, later described the scene below. It was not war, it was execution. Kilometer after kilometer of German vehicles, German artillery, German horses, German men, all trying to escape. And our observers calling in coordinates. And the Allied artillery firing. And everything below us dying. By August 21, the Falaise pocket was sealed. Those Germans who had escaped, perhaps 20 to 30,000 men, had done so on foot, abandoning all their equipment. Those who remained were dead or prisoners. The statistics tell the story, but they fail to convey the horror. Allied records indicated approximately 10,000 Germans killed inside the pocket. Another 50,000 captured. 350 tanks destroyed or abandoned. 2,500 other vehicles destroyed. 250 artillery pieces captured or destroyed. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, toured the Falaise battlefield shortly after the battle ended. He had seen combat in North Africa, Sicily, Italy. He was not a man easily shocked. But Falaise shocked him. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, Eisenhower wrote, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The roads through the pocket were choked with destroyed equipment, overturned trucks, burned-out panzers, smashed artillery pieces, dead horses by the thousands. The German army still relied on horse-drawn transport, and the horses had been slaughtered wholesale by artillery fire. And among the wreckage, the bodies. Bodies in field gray. Bodies in black panzer uniforms. Bodies in pieces. Bodies that would not be identified. Bodies that would be buried in mass graves. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, the corps commander who had ordered Bayerline to hold at all costs in July, did not survive to see Falaise. He was killed by Allied artillery fire on June 12, just 6 days after the Normandy landings. His death was indicative of what would happen to the entire German army in the West. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach, who had described American artillery superiority with such precision, was captured in September 1944. In his post-war interrogations by Allied intelligence officers, he provided detailed assessments of why Germany lost in Normandy. It was the artillery, Eberbach said. Not the air forces, though they were devastating. Not the tanks, though the Shermans outnumbered our panzers. It was the artillery that destroyed us. We could not move. We could not concentrate. We could not establish defensive positions without being shelled. We could not attack without being shelled. We could not retreat without being shelled. He continued, the Americans treated artillery as their primary weapon. Everything else supported the artillery. Their infantry advanced to positions where observers could call in artillery fire. Their tanks created situations where artillery could be employed. Their aircraft spotted targets for artillery. The entire American military system was designed to bring artillery to bear on German positions. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, before he was wounded and before he was implicated in the July 20th plot against Hitler and forced to commit suicide, wrote about Allied artillery in his letters and reports. The enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, Rommel wrote, and even more in the air, has broken the front open. Later, after weeks of combat in Normandy, Rommel wrote again. Also in evidence is their great superiority in artillery and outstandingly large supply of ammunition. These were not casual observations. These were assessments written by professional soldiers who had spent careers studying warfare. They understood what they were witnessing. And what they were witnessing was the obsolescence of the kind of warfare they had been trained to fight. The German army in World War II was a formidable fighting force. Man for man, unit for unit, the Germans were arguably the most tactically proficient army in the conflict. German infantry squads fought with a cohesion and aggressiveness that Allied troops struggled to match. German tank crews were better trained and more experienced than their American counterparts. German officers excelled at small unit tactics and rapid decision-making. But none of that mattered when the Americans could bring overwhelming artillery fire to bear. A German infantry company, brilliantly positioned and expertly led, could be destroyed by artillery without ever seeing an American soldier. A German panzer battalion, executing a textbook flanking maneuver, could be interdicted by artillery fire and stopped cold. A German regiment, preparing for a carefully planned counterattack, could be shattered by a time-on-target mission before the attack even began. The Germans tried to adapt. They learned to move only at night. They dispersed their forces to reduce the effectiveness of area bombardments. They dug deeper foxholes and built better bunkers. They tried to knock out American forward observers before they could call in fire. None of it worked. Not really. Because the fundamental problem was not tactical. It was strategic. It was industrial. It was philosophical. The United States outproduced Germany by staggering margins. In 1944 alone, American factories manufactured more than 17,000 artillery pieces. Germany manufactured perhaps 5,000. American factories produced millions of artillery shells. Germany struggled to produce hundreds of thousands. These numbers translated directly into battlefield capability. An American division had more artillery than a German corps. An American corps had more artillery than a German army. And American logistics could keep those guns supplied indefinitely. German logistics could barely keep German guns in minimal operation. The result was a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Every German soldier killed by artillery was irreplaceable. Every German gun destroyed by counter-battery fire was lost forever. Every German vehicle hit by artillery fire was removed from the order of battle. The Americans, meanwhile, replaced losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. By September 1944, after 3 months of combat in Normandy, the German army in the West had lost more than 40 divisions. Not depleted, not reduced, lost, ceased to exist as functioning military formations. The 7th Army had been annihilated at Falaise. The 5th Panzer Army had been ground down to nothing. Panzer divisions that had entered Normandy with 200 tanks had perhaps 20. Infantry divisions that had entered with 12,000 men had 2,000. And everywhere, in every after-action report, in every commander's assessment, in every prisoner interrogation, the same word appeared. Artillery. American artillery. The thing that killed us. The thing we could not stop. The thing that made it impossible to fight. The German generals who wrote about American artillery did so with a kind of professional horror. Not fear exactly. These were men who had seen years of combat, who had survived the Eastern Front, who were not easily frightened. But horror at the realization that everything they knew about warfare, everything they had been trained to do, everything they believed about the primacy of soldier quality and tactical skill, had been rendered obsolete by American industrial firepower. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, who survived the war, wrote extensively about his experiences in Normandy. In his post-war manuscripts, he returned again and again to July 25, 1944, the day Panzer Lehr died. "I have been in combat since 1939, Bayerlein wrote. I fought in Poland, in France, in Russia, in Africa. I saw Stalingrad. I saw the withdrawal from El Alamein. I thought I had seen everything war could show me, but I had seen nothing compared to what the Americans did to my division in Normandy. He described the American system with a kind of bitter admiration. They had no need for tactical brilliance. They simply called down artillery fire on any obstacle. It did not matter if the obstacle was a German strongpoint or a German company or a German battalion. The result was the same. The obstacle ceased to exist. Bayerlein continued. Our own artillery was excellent. Our gunners were superb. But we had no ammunition. We had no forward observers in aircraft. We had no ability to coordinate fires from multiple divisions. We had no logistics to support sustained fire missions. We fought with what we had. And what we had was not enough. The story of American artillery supremacy in World War II is ultimately a story about how industrialized nations fight wars. It is a story about the application of industrial management principles to military operations. It is a story about standardization, mass production, and overwhelming logistical support. The Germans built beautiful weapons, precise weapons, weapons that reflected German engineering excellence and craftsmanship. But they could not build enough of them, and they could not supply them adequately, and they could not coordinate them effectively. The Americans built adequate weapons, good enough weapons, weapons that worked reliably and could be produced by the millions. And then they built the systems to supply them, to coordinate them, to employ them with ruthless efficiency. The philosophical difference was profound. The Germans sought quality. The Americans sought quantity. And in industrial warfare, quantity had a quality all its own. By the war's end, American artillery had fired an estimated 25 million shells in the European theater of operations. 25 million. Each shell represented industrial capacity, steel production, explosive manufacturing, brass cartridge fabrication, logistics, transportation, all coordinated to deliver high explosive onto German positions thousands of kilometers from American factories. The Germans could not match this. They could not even comprehend it. The scale of American production was beyond German experience. German generals who had spent their careers studying warfare, who had read Clausewitz and Moltke, who understood maneuver and mass and concentration of force, found themselves facing an enemy who simply produced more stuff than they could destroy. And so German generals wrote about American artillery with terror. Not because individual American guns were superior, they were not. Not because American gunners were more skilled, they were not. But because the entire American system, from factories in Detroit to forward observers in Norman hedgerows, was designed to bring overwhelming firepower to bear on German positions. And that system worked. Brutally, efficiently, relentlessly. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket ended 72 days after D-Day. In those 72 days, the German army in the West suffered approximately 300,000 casualties. Of those casualties, historians estimate that artillery accounted for more than any other weapon. More than tanks. More than aircraft. More than small arms. Artillery. American artillery. Industrial artillery. The weapon that terrified German generals. The weapon they wrote about with horror. The weapon that proved, conclusively, that in modern industrial warfare, production capacity matters more than tactical skill. Logistics matters more than courage. Systems matter more than soldiers. This was the lesson the Germans learned in Normandy. And it was a lesson they could do nothing about. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.